guys, so in this lesson I'm going to be discussing avoid notes. Now, as the name implies, avoid notes are notes in the scale of the key that you're in that you want to avoid. So to give you an example, if you have a simple progression like a 2-5-1 in C major, that entire chord progression is in the key of C major, so you can improvise over that chord progression using the C major scale. Right, nice and easy up to this point. Now, not all notes within the scale are equal. There are some notes which are much stronger harmonically, and they're notes that sound good when you improvise or when you create a melody. And they're known as guide tones or guide notes. And they're essentially the third and the seventh of the chord. And I've got a separate video on that, which you should go and watch if you don't understand guide notes. Now, just like there are strong notes within that scale, there are also weak notes within the scale. And these weak notes are called avoid notes. So to keep that analogy going, the strong notes or the guide notes that you would play in the scale depend on the chord that you're on in the chord progression. So if you're on the D minor 7, the guide tones are the third and the seventh, that is the F and the C. On the G7, the guide notes are the F and the B. And on the C major 7, the guide tones are the E and the B. Right? So they're all the strong notes. Now, avoid notes work in a similar way. Every chord in the key of C major, and every chord, therefore, in that little chord progression, has its own specific avoid notes. Now, you can see them all in summary in the picture-in-picture in this video, but I'll go through each one of them now, and I'll explain why each one is an avoid note. So essentially, an avoid note is just a note that creates an awkward and a dissonant and an unpleasant harmony with the notes in the chord, with the chord tone. So in music there are sort of consonant or nice sounding intervals, like for example the perfect fifth, and then there are dissonant or not particularly nice sounding intervals like minor thirds. Right? This kind of sounds nice, kind of like this two notes mix well together. This sounds like they're kind of clashing. Now, I'll make a completely separate video on dissonant intervals because they are quite important when you're improvising as well, and they're a good way to build tensions. But just for the moment, all you need to know is there are some intervals that are considered dissonant and not pleasant to the ear. And avoid notes are notes that create those dissonant intervals with the notes in the chord that you're playing. So the two dissonant intervals that I'm going to be using in this video are the tritone, so 3 tones up. Right, that sounds really dissonant and really quite like jarring to the ear. And the minor ninth, which is essentially a semitone interval, but an octave apart. Right? That sounds also really dissonant and really jarring. So let's stay in the key of C major. Your one chord is the C major. Your avoid note is the F. Right? That sounds a bit jarring, a bit unpleasant. And the reason is because that note creates a flat 9 interval with the E, with the third. Right? So it's considered a weak note harmonically if you're improvising. If we're on the D minor 7, the weak note is the B, and that's because that creates a tritone with the third. Also a jarring interval. On the E minor 7, the 3, the avoid note is the F, which creates a flat 9 interval with the root note, and the C, which creates a flat 9 interval with the fifth. Now, for the F major 7, the 4 chord, there are no avoid notes. You can play whatever note you like. The 5 chord, the G7, the avoid note is the C, because again that creates a flat 9 interval with the third. For the 6 chord, the A minor, the avoid note is the F, because again that creates the flat 9 interval with the fifth. Then for the 7 chord, the B half diminished, the avoid note is the C. because again that creates a flat 9 interval with the B, with the root. So I've more or less just summarized what you can see here in the picture-in-picture, and so I've highlighted the avoid notes red, and the guide notes I've just bolded, but still in black. But really, you want to be looking at the red notes, which are the avoid notes. So if you have, again, a simple chord progression, like that 2-5-1 that I mentioned earlier, D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7 in the key of C major. So looking at that chord progression, you can see that it's in the key of C major. Therefore, you can use the C major scale as I've discussed. But while you're improvising using that C major scale, you want to try to avoid the avoid notes on each chord. So when you're improvising over the D minor 7, you want to avoid the B. To the G7, you want to avoid the C. And then you want to avoid the F when you get to the C major. So that's what avoid notes are, and essentially what to do with them, or I suppose more accurately in this case, what not to do with them. So when you've got a simple chord progression, you want to be targeting the guide tones, but avoiding the avoid notes. And then doing those two things, you can create a really, really strong, nice improvisation. Though I should say, like everything in jazz theory, these rules that are given you are not sort of concrete, necessary rules that you have to adhere to. Just because an avoid note is a weak note, considered a weak note harmonically while improvising, doesn't mean you have to completely avoid it. What it really means is that if you sit on an avoid note for a long time, or focus in on it, or sort of plan your improvisation around it, so that sounds horrible because I'm specifically targeting and repeating and really emphasizing that avoid note. That's the type of thing you should try to avoid doing. Using avoid notes as passing notes, like quickly just going through them, sounds perfectly fine, especially because you can sort of use it as a passing note on the way to a guide tone. And I'll do a separate video on targeting and passing notes, because that's a whole other interesting topic that we can discuss. But essentially, the way you need to think about these avoid notes is not so much to completely avoid them, but to try not to focus on them or to overemphasize them in your improvisation. Now, it might be a bit difficult for you to memorize every single avoid note for every mode or chord that you're in a given key, especially if you start changing keys. So there is a sort of shorter way or an easier way to remember the avoid notes that's not 100% accurate, but it's sort of close enough. Which is, on a major chord, you want to avoid the 4th, which is also the 11th, which is incidentally the reason you don't often see a major 11 chord written out in a lot of sheet music, because it's quite a dissonant and unpleasant sound. So for a major chord, you want to avoid the 4th, and for a minor chord, you want to avoid the 6th, which is also the 13th, which is why, again, you don't see too many minor 13 chords. And then for a diminished chord, you want to avoid the 2nd. So that's an easy way to remember it. And like I said, if you try reconcile that little approximate rule to the actual table that I had up in the picture-in-picture earlier, you'll notice that not all the notes actually fit like that. Like, for example, the 4 chord doesn't have any avoid notes, whereas in my little approximate rule, you would be avoiding the B. So it's not 100%, but it's close enough, and you can sort of use that as a rough guide to when you're improvising. Just know that, major chord, I want to be avoiding the 4th, minor chord, I want to be avoiding the 6th, diminished chord, I want to be avoiding the 2nd. Cool, and so that's everything I really wanted to cover about avoid notes. Feel free to leave any questions or comments if any of that didn't make sense to you. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and yeah, thanks, see ya.